Good morning. I want to welcome you if you're visiting with us, and good to see all of our members here that are present today. And on Sunday morning, we are studying the book of Hebrews. Last week was our first class, and really we just did an introduction. We'll have a couple of concluding marks about that, and then we'll begin in chapter 1. At the end of class last week, we had this slide up, and I just want to say a couple things about it. The book of Hebrews is an amazing book. It has a simple purpose. And so I put these questions up here. Do you ever feel like your faith is challenged, tempting you to look for an easier path? Being a Christian is not easy. It's not easy. But it's also not difficult. And we're going to talk about that theme a little bit here this morning. But sometimes we are tempted to look for an easier path, an easier way out. Are you ever tempted to hide your faith or seek the safety of compliance? That's one of the easy paths, isn't it? To just not go against the grain, just as much as you can, find a way to blend in, to just go with the flow, to face less resistance from the things around you. And then sometimes we are just defeated by our own sinfulness, our own desires, which overcome us, overtake us, pull us away from God, and now we are trying to avoid the scrutiny of the mirror of faith. The writer of Hebrews is addressing all of those things. He's very aware of the challenges to faith from the world around us, the temptation to shrink back, and he is pleading and making a very elaborate argument for enduring faith. But he also is very mindful of the threat of sin. And so he's addressing these things, and we saw that a little bit in our introduction. So I think all of us at some point in our life, and maybe today, can say yes to one of these questions. And so what I want you to do is look at this book as an answer to those things, an answer to those questions. John, I think you got the wrong slide up. Did I? It's on. Luckily, I have a copy of them here. Give him a second and see if we can get that going. All right. We'll just move on for now. So the thing that I want you to do, turn over, we used the chapter 13, and the end of chapter 13 is kind of a place for us to gather some facts that helped us answer some questions about the letter. And one thing that I want to begin with this morning, just a moment, going back to chapter 13, towards the end, this comes across as a sermon, this letter. It doesn't really come across as a letter so much until you get here at the end where there are some personal remarks that are being made. So when we get to these personal remarks, let's see if we can get caught up here. We're back. I think you may have the slide from last week, not this week's file. Unless maybe I sent you the wrong one, which is possible. Because that's where the slide ended last week. All right, so when we go to chapter 13, when we get to chapter 13, he says, I urge you, brethren, verse 22, bear with this word of exhortation. So the writer describes his letter as a word of exhortation. So he's trying to encourage them and exhort them to carry on, to endure, to escape and flee from the pressures of sin. And so the whole letter is meant as a word of encouragement. It's easy to read this letter in disconnected ways and pay attention to the very high theology that's included in the letter, because it certainly is. The loftiest language in the New Testament is in the letter to the Hebrews. What's close to it might be Ephesians 1, Colossians 1, very similar. It had a lot of parallels. But for the most part, this is the loftiest language. It is the deepest, the headiest language in the New Testament. But the writer who wrote it says it's a letter of exhortation. It's a letter of encouragement. So we don't want to lose sight of that aspect of this as we go through. So I urge you, brethren, to bear with this word of exhortation. And then I want to bring your attention also along those same lines to Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. So we're going to study the book backwards. That's what it looks like right now. But if you go to Hebrews chapter 12, we'll just work our way back to chapter 1 like this. But in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1, it says, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witness surrounding us. Now keep in mind, the previous chapter is this great chapter on faith that we're all very familiar with. And so at the conclusion of that, he begins his next paragraph with, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us. The cloud of witnesses surrounding us. This image of everyone who's gone before, as though they're gathering in this circle around us. And now they are watching us like we just read about them. He says, with this cloud of witness surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Fixing your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Now, if you've been reading, and hopefully several people have already come up and said, hey, I did what you said, and I just read Hebrews, beginning all the way through. And several people have already said, wow, it changed how I understand Hebrews. It's a long letter. And we grab passages, because there's so many great passages in Hebrews. We grab a passage to show this, and we grab another passage, and we show this. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I mean, those are great passages which make great points. But in the context of the letter, it reads differently. So I hope that you had a chance to do that. And if you've been reading it, when you read this passage, you recognize that this is a summary of the letter. He is summarizing and saying, you know, after these great faiths, he says, lay aside every encumbrance and lay aside the sin and run with endurance. You're on a course and you've got to endure. You've got to handle the things that are before you. And the key to doing that is to look at Jesus. Look at Jesus. And so what he does, beginning in the first chapter, is he presents to us Jesus and everything about Jesus. The enduring of the cross, which brought us salvation. Despising the shame, which is part of their problem, is the resistance of the world around them, the pressure of the world around. He says Jesus despised the shame. and endured the cross, but now he sits at the right hand of the throne of God. So that's the purpose of the letter. That is where we're going. That's what he's trying to do in this letter, is he's saying, I know you had all these things going on around you, and I know it's like some days it's just hard to keep going, and then there's sin pulling at you all the time. Just look at Jesus. Fix your eyes on Jesus. And remember who he is and what he has done and where he is now and what he's doing now. And then get up and take another step. Resist a little harder. Keep going. Keep running the race. Now, there are a lot of things that are implied in that as well that we'll get to in the course of our class. But that's really what he's doing in this letter. If you'll turn over to chapter 1, I want to say just a moment about some generic comments about Bible study. I'm a big believer that the Bible is simple. That the main message is obvious. Almost everywhere. I mean, if you read the book of Revelation and you start trying to dissect and understand every image, every statement in Revelation, it becomes overwhelming pretty quickly. But if you sit down and just read through Revelation, you can't miss the point. And that is the saints are victorious. The saints are going to be victorious. And at the end, we're going to be with the Lord. That message is simple. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't some complex things, because the Bible is both simple and complex at the same time. This letter is a testimony to that. The complexity of the scriptures. So I would say to someone who's starting out studying the Bible, it's simple. You're going to get the point. You're going to get lost on the way a few times, but you're going to get the point. And what you understand as you begin to read the scriptures and you begin to study the scriptures and you begin to look further, you begin to realize that you can't get to the bottom of that well. You can't exhaust the things that can be gleaned from the scriptures. Now, I say all that to say that's going to be true in this class. It is painful for me to think of all the things we will not be able to talk about in this class, because we could spend this entire class on chapter 1. And so we're going to try and pick and choose our battles with that. But just know that a class like this should not be, hey, I'm going to go to this class and at the end I'm going to understand everything about Hebrews. No, this class should be, I'm going to come to this class and get inspired to study Hebrews more. Because that's all we're going to be able to do for you, is to get you looking at Hebrews in the right way and begin to see how much there is to pursue in your understanding. And I think we're going to see a little bit of that this morning, even though we're going to just try to give the most cursory view. Now, the other thing, besides reading Hebrews, I asked everybody to read Deuteronomy chapter 4. And I asked you specifically to read Deuteronomy 4 out loud. There's two reasons for that. One is it's hard to get through it without reading it out loud, because it's a deep, involving thing. But I think I know for me, it makes a much deeper impression on me anytime I read out loud, but particularly when I read Deuteronomy out loud, I finished and I just almost let out a gasp because of the moment that Deuteronomy 4 is describing. The context of Deuteronomy 4, and I know you're thinking, well, isn't this a class about Hebrews? Yeah, but we're getting there. We're getting to Hebrews eventually. But in Deuteronomy chapter 4, we have this moment where Moses, who has led the people from Egypt, who has led them through the wilderness and all of the things that happen in the wilderness, but because of a mistake is not going to go into the promised land. Deuteronomy is a farewell speech, right? Deuteronomy is Moses saying, look, I can't go over, but you're going to go over. And here's what you need to know. Here's what I need to remind you of before you go over. And in Deuteronomy chapter 4, if you'll turn over there very quickly, we're not going to read Deuteronomy 4, but we're going to read a couple things. If you've read Hebrews and then you read Deuteronomy, did you notice any similarities in Deuteronomy 4 in the letter to the Hebrews? You should have noticed a lot of similarities, many similarities. It's almost as though Deuteronomy 4 was Hebrews before Hebrews in some ways, in some very glaring ways. And that's why I wanted you to read it. It's so similar. But the part that I want to really pay attention to is beginning in verse 32. Ryan, in a recent sermon, talked about the Exodus and the miracles of the Exodus and the miracles that all the Israelites had seen, and yet they were unfaithful. And that illustration is going to be used in our letter to Hebrews, right? So the people that Moses is speaking to here later are an illustration of unfaithfulness, which the letter of the Hebrews is saying, don't be like them. But here they are getting this same message that the Hebrew writer is giving to us as Christians. But he says in verse 32, indeed, ask now concerning the former days, which were before you, since the day that God created man on the earth, and inquire from one end of the heavens to the other. Has anything been done like this great thing, or has anything been heard like it? Now, how does our letter begin? God has spoke in the days of old to the fathers and the prophets. And here he says, ask concerning the former days, which were before you since the day that God created man on the earth, and inquire from one end of the heavens to the other. Has anything been done like this great thing, or has anything been heard like it? Has any people heard the voice of God speaking from the midst of the fire as you have heard it and survived? Or has a God tried to take for himself a nation from within another nation by trials and signs and wonders and by war and by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm and by great terrors, as the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? To you it was shown that you might know that he is the Lord, that you may know the Lord, he is God, that there is no other besides him. Out of the heavens he let you hear his voice to discipline you. And on earth he let you see his great fire, and you heard his words from the midst of the fire, because he loved your fathers. Therefore he chose their descendants after them. He personally brought you from Egypt by his great power. Has anybody seen this before? Go all the way to the beginning of the creation. Has anybody seen a God speak to his people? Let them hear the voice of their God? No, that had never happened. Has any God chosen for himself a people and brought them out of another people to be his own people? No, no one's ever seen anything like that before. And that's similar to the message that we have here in Hebrews chapter 1. He begins by pointing to the past. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions and many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the world. And he is the radiance of his glory, the exact representation of his nature, and upholds all things by the word of his power. When he had made purification of sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much better than the angels as he had inherited a more excellent name than they. We've lost our PowerPoint again, John. That was it? Okay, all right. So apparently we didn't send the right file or something. So, but we're good. So in this passage, he says, look to the past, to the prophets in the past, but God has now done something never seen before. God has done something great and mighty that has never been seen before. He has spoken to us in his Son. Now, if you look at this passage and you place yourself in the position of the prophets, he says, God spoke to the fathers in the prophets, and he uses a couple of phrases here, in many portions and in many ways. Those two phrases are translated a lot of different ways. I'm reading from the New American Standard Bible, which describes it in many portions and in many ways, which I think is a very accurate translation of it. He says, long ago, whether that be, and there's some debate about what that means, long ago, as in terms of a long time ago, or, because some translations will say the days of old. And the word old there could be two different meanings. It could be old as in old, or old as in worn out, ready to be replaced. And in fact, maybe it's the idea of both is in this, where he says, he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions, in many ways. Many portions, meaning in amounts, in bits and pieces. He spoke in bits and pieces. And he also spoke in a lot of different ways. So when we think about a lot of different ways, there's this idea of, think about the Old Testament. Just if you talk about the genres of the written word, right? There's the historical narratives, right? There's the wisdom literature, there's the poetry, there's the prophecies. There's all these different genres and ways in which God communicates to us. I mean, there's the Song of Solomon, for crying out loud. What do you do with that? But it is God speaking to us, communicating with us in all these different ways. But then beyond that, when you start thinking about all the ways that God, illustrated himself, when we look at Hebrews, there's the illustration of the wonders that created the exit from Egypt, the signs and wonders, the miracles, or the wonders of the wilderness wandering. And I'm speaking of those in particular because those are things that are going to become relevant in this letter. But there are many other things that we could look at, all the different ways God presented himself and illustrated. But what never happened is nobody ever had the full picture. And many portions is the bits and pieces that God was painting a picture, and really painting a picture is probably not even the best way to describe it if we described it as a jigsaw puzzle. You put together a jigsaw puzzle. My mother in her later years, we did jigsaw puzzles on her kitchen table, and we'd spread them out. And we'd try to group them by color. We'd look for the edge pieces first, and we'd try to create the edge. So we knew here's the frame of this picture. And then we would start putting together colors, and we'd try to piece things together and put it all together. And at first, it didn't make any sense. Now, we cheated, right? Because we had the box. We had the whole picture from the beginning. But imagine putting together a jigsaw puzzle, and you don't have the box. You have no idea what the picture is going to be. You just have colors and little pieces and fragments of portions of the picture. That's what the prophets were. Pieces of the puzzle. And what we discover is, look over to 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 10. He says, as to this salvation, the prophets who prophesied of the grace that would come to you made careful searches and inquiries. So in other words, they knew. They didn't have the whole picture. They had pieces of the picture. They had clues and hints, and so they made careful searches and inquiries. They were aware that they didn't have the whole picture. They were seeking to know what person or time the Spirit of Christ within them was indicating as he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the glories to follow. It was revealed to them that they were not serving themselves, but you. So they knew they weren't the recipients of the full picture. They were putting together a picture. They were inquiring, he says, and it was made known to them that they weren't serving themselves. In other words, it wasn't for them to know, but it was for people of the future that they prophesied, that their work was being done. Even when we look at the prophets as they spoke to the Israelites, as they spoke to the kings, and they were dealing with these very specific situations, were very clear about what was going to happen and what someone should do and all of that. Even those events that they were so clear about and they had a clear picture of were simply a piece in the puzzle of a much greater picture that they didn't know. When we get further into chapter 1, when we get to the comparison of Christ to the angels, if you've noticed reading, if you looked at your references, there are a lot of psalms being quoted, psalm after psalm after psalm after psalm. Do you think the people who read the psalm when it was written and they used it in their temple worship, do you think they understood the meaning that the writer of Hebrews gives those psalms? No. They didn't understand all of that. But we now see it. He says, but you, continuing in verse 12 of 1 Peter 1, but you and these things which now have been announced to you through those who preach the gospel to you by the Holy Spirit sent from heaven, things which angels long to look. He says the prophets weren't serving themselves, they were serving you. You who have received the whole picture. You who now have the entire revelation. You now have the box of the puzzle. You've now put the last piece in the puzzle. And now you have this whole picture. And by the way, along the way, he says, the angels were curious. The angels were looking on all of this, trying to figure out what it was God was doing. So the angels didn't have the answers any more than the prophets, any more than the people of old, any more than the fathers, any more than Abraham or Moses, all of whom had a promise, a piece of the puzzle. We don't have time, but you could go to Ephesians chapter 1 and see much of this is talked about in Ephesians chapter 2, when Paul talks about the grace and the demonstration for the ages to come in Christ. And I've always understood that passage this way, that when in Ephesians chapter 2, when he talks about that he might demonstrate for the ages to come the great love with which he loved us. The ages to come there, it's like, we have the full picture of who Christ is. We do not yet have the full picture of who we are. What role are we? Why did God do all of this? Because we're not all there is. We are not all there is. We are but another illustration to the ages to come. For whatever God does next, whatever is to be, he will be able to point to us and say, look at who I am. Look at what I have done. And so we ourselves, I think, are an illustration for all that God is. the great love with which he has loved us, that he will be able to point to in the ages to come and say, look, this is who I am. Back to Ephesians chapter 1. I'm pretty sure we're going to cover a couple of verses today. But looking ahead, we are going to get through most of chapter 2 next week. We're going to move a little quicker next week. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions, in these different pieces, in many different ways of illustrating it, different men, different times, different methods, in these last days, has spoken to us in his Son. In these last days, we're not going to talk about that phrase very much. There's a lot to be said about that and how to understand that. He's not talking about the end times here, but he's talking about the dispensation that we're in. Either the concluding day of the prior dispensation or in the period of the current dispensation, in these times, in the times that were predicted. You know, in John chapter 12, verse 27, Jesus says, what should I say, Father? Should I seek to escape all of this? No, for it is for this hour that I'm here. For this hour. And this is a phrase similar to that. He's not saying, Jesus wasn't saying in John 12, this specific hour, but he's kind of like saying, this is my moment. I'm in this moment, this part of all that has happened and all that will happen. In this moment, I am to do these things. And here he says, in these last days, in the culmination of everything, in chapter 9 and verse 26, he says, he would have needed to suffer often since the foundation of the world, referring to something. He says, but now once at the consummation of the ages, he has been manifested to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. So this consummation of the ages, I think that's what he's talking about. In these last days, he has spoken to us in his Son. Now, another one of these possible divergences to explain something, but here, when it says in his Son, literally in the Greek it just says in Son. And the difference in that, because is he God's Son? Yes. Does it do anything wrong to this passage to say in his Son? No. But when you understand in the Greek it just says in Son, the emphasis is not on the fact that he's God's Son, but the fact that he being Son is significant. He's going to go on to say, whom he appointed heir of all things. So it is Christ's position as Son, as heir, that is significant here. And of course, he is God's Son. Yeah. He's not just any heir, but he is the heir of God, the heir of all things. Through whom also he made the world. So he's describing God or Christ in a way. And something I didn't do because we didn't have the PowerPoint up there. I missed this one thing that I just want to say briefly. What we find in this letter is a series of comparisons. First, there's a comparison to the prophets in verses 1 through 3 of chapter 1. There's a comparison to the angels, which we'll be picking up next week, chapters 1, verse 4 through chapter 2, verse 18. There's a comparison of Moses, and we can throw Joshua in there. Joshua is mentioned, but it's really the work of Moses. The comparison to Moses and Joshua. A comparison to the priesthood of Aaron in chapters 14 through 8:6. And finally, a comparison of the Old and new covenants. So there's a series of comparisons, and what we're in the middle of is the first of those comparisons, and that is the comparison of Jesus to the prophets. And the first major point is he is son. So the prophets, the various methods, the various men carrying a piece of God's word, messengers who receive the word and then give it. If we took the time to go back to Deuteronomy chapter 4, early in the chapter, what does he say? He says, God has given me these commandments so that I can give them to you. That's how Moses describes it. God has given me this. And they witnessed him going up onto the mountain. God has given me this that I might give it to you. And that's what the prophets were. They were spokespersons, messengers from God. But here, Jesus is contrasted in that he is not a messenger. He is the message. He's not receiving it from God. He is God. He is the Son, the heir of all things, through whom God made the world. He is the creator. He is the Son, the heir. And heir simply means he owns everything. He owns everything. And he created everything. He is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature. A lot of different translations of that, essentially saying the same thing. But he is he is the image of God. This word here where it says he is the exact representation, that's the same word that would be used in the Greek to talk about stamping the image of Caesar on a coin. Remember when Jesus, when they asked him about taxes and all of these things, and he says, take a coin, and whose image is on the coin? Well, Caesar's. And render unto Caesar's that which is Caesar's, and unto God that which is God. And what this is saying is Jesus is the image of God. When you see Jesus, you see God. And we talked last week about this a little bit when we talked about John chapter 14 and verse 9, where Philip says, show us the Father. He says, have I been with you so long? And you say, show us the Father. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. The exact image, the radiance of God's glory. And what is the glory of God? Think back to the building of the first temple. Remember the glory of God descended upon the temple. The glory of God is the presence of God. He is the radiance of God's presence. He is the exact representation of God's nature, and he upholds all things by the word of his power. Not only is he creator, but he upholds all things. In fact, if you go back earlier where it says, through whom also he made the world, the word world there is really in the plural. It is talking about not just this, but everything. Some translations will use the word universe there to make sure that we understand. He's not just talking about the earth. He's talking about everything. He's talking about the entire thing. And he upholds all of it by the word of his power. So everything that exists continues to exist because of the word of the power of Jesus Christ. So, if he sustains all of that, can he sustain you? Jesus is not just another prophet. He's not just a great teacher. He's not some great moral man who presented this great moral code that you can follow it or you can follow some other code. He says he is the Son. He owns everything. He made it all. He sustains it all. He is God manifest. And then finally he says, he made the purification of sins. He is salvation. So he dealt with that which the old law couldn't deal with. And having done so, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. So we'll begin with the comparison, number 2, the comparison of Jesus to the angels next week.
Son of my soul, thou Savior dear, it is not night if thou be near. O may no earth-born cloud arise to hide thee from thy servant.